They're rebuilding them. If you look at some of the ones upstairs, they're totally new. They're rebuilding everything in the inside of them.
By the time I get downstairs, the place be over.
But I know it's inconvenient if you're on the floor that they're rebuilding. Okay, folks. Now, if somebody missed the roll, sign it on the way out. It'll be up here. But so let me go over this because we're starting a little bit late because we. And is Jada Simpson here? No. Again, I don't know which. Is Elizabeth Penny here? Did she come in? She may be in section 2. That's a problem with. I learn people's names much better when I call a roll, but I haven't been doing that this semester. Okay. Well, the tape is rolling here, so the 5 ways are 5 ways to prove God's existence. The 4th way I never deal with. The first 3 ways are versions of what is called a cosmological argument. The argument that says the cosmos had to have a necessary first cause. We are not really looking at that argument very much, but we're looking at the design argument. The design argument also is called the teleological argument. Telos is the word for purpose. And the argument basically says, wait, there are things in nature that serve purposes. And this is Aquinas' point. Aquinas borrows Aristotle's view of the world. And for Aristotle, things in nature are imbued with purposes. Nature isn't just a mechanical system. After Newton and after Darwin, the tendency among modern science is to view nature as just a mechanical system where natural laws govern how things behave, but where things are not directed at any purpose. But for Aristotle, things have purposes. We saw this in his Ethics. So why can't they direct themselves toward the goal to go to the review sheet? Well, Aquinas says you need an intelligence to direct something to its goal. And basically this was Paley's point. And so why do things in nature need to... what do things in nature need to direct them toward an end? Well, an external intelligence, basically. And of course, Aquinas uses the example of an archer. An arrow is not going to fly and hit its goal just by itself. It needs to be directed toward the target by an intelligence. In this case, the intelligence of the archer. And so, he says the same thing with things in nature. If they're directed toward goals or purposes, they need a designer to direct them that way. Now, we look at Paley and the copy. Hold on, let me pause it. Darn. All right, so I didn't record that. So anyway, Paley finds a watch in a field, and what makes the watch different from the stone is tell us that the watch has a series of parts that are intricately, constructed to enable it to fulfill a function or purpose, namely moving the hand so that it functions as a timepiece. And he says, this is what I did not discover in the stone, and it's what makes me think that, unlike the stone, the watch needed a designer to design it and build it to fulfill, so that all those parts intricately work together to fulfill a function or purpose. Now, later in that Paley reading, I have another short clip where Paley draws the analogy out. Remember, an argument from analogy says A and B are alike in certain respects. In this case, Paley would say the watch is like something else in nature, and Paley talks about the eye. But he says the same thing goes for a number of other things, like ears and parts of plants. Paley's natural theology is kind of interesting to look at. I had an old copy from the 1800s that I bought at a used bookstore in the 1970s, and it had a lot of line drawings of parts of plants and animals. Basically, Paley hammers home the same point time and time again. He says, well, look at this part of this animal. You tell me that got that way by accident, by chance, by an I don't know what principle of nature, or was it designed? This is essentially how Paley's argument goes. And so he says, look, there are things in nature that are like things in that human beings construct, in that, like the watch, they have a series of intricate parts that work together to fulfill a function or purpose. So those are the premises. You're saying, well, things in nature like eyes and ears are like watches and buildings in that they have, intricate parts that work together to fulfill a purpose. And so how do we drive the analogy home? Well, we say, okay, if they're alike in those respects, the watch didn't just get there, it needed a designer. Why wouldn't these things in nature need a designer? And who would the designer of the eye be, other than the author of nature with a capital A, God himself? That's how the argument goes, and it's an analogy. Now, David Hume criticizes the design argument. He thinks it's a weak analogy, first of all, because he says the universe isn't like a constructed object, like a house or later Paley's watch, right? Where it was planned and designed all at once. So, Hume says if the things you're comparing aren't very like one another, and he gives this example of saying you have a strong argument from analogy if things are very much alike, like human blood circulation when you're comparing it from one person to another. And even if you're talking about animals and human beings, you have a strong argument that they have similar types of circulatory systems. But Hume says when you get far away with the things you're comparing, like comparing a stalk of corn or a tree, and the way sap goes in plants, to the human circulatory system, you may be led to a wrong conclusion, and your argument doesn't have much evidence. And the point is, you can say, well, a corn stalk or a tree is very similar to the human circulatory system in that it has tubules where liquid flows, in this case sap instead of blood. So if blood circulates in animals, it ought to circulate in plants. Well, Hume says that would be a wrong conclusion. Now, is Hume just concerned to talk about trees? No. You can see where he's going with this. He's trying to say, look, the design argument, if you're comparing things like a house, a built and designed and constructed item, to something like the universe, and they're not very much alike, he says maybe we could be led to a completely false conclusion, i.e. that there's a God, a designer. Remember, Hume's a skeptical philosopher. He's Philo. And so he's trying to say that none of these arguments that compare, the universe to a house or something like that work. They're bad analogies. Plus, he says we don't have multiple examples. If you're reasoning from like examples, in other words, I take the second match out of the matchbook, it's just like the first match. When I strike it on the striker, I expect it to do exactly the same thing that the first match did, namely light. Why? I'm comparing very similar things. And plus, I have many things. But Hume says, we only have one example of supposed design, namely this universe. And it isn't like we say, okay, now here's universe A over here, and that needed a designer, and here's universe B over here, and that needed a designer, and I have 5 universes that I'm looking at, and they all needed a designer, so therefore this universe must have needed a designer. Hume says we only have one example. So we can't reason well about that. Okay. So where are we in this review sheet? To what does Cleanthes compare the universe? Now, Cleanthes gives the design argument, and he says the universe is like a big giant machine. This is the clockwork universe. In other words, they thought the laws of nature are so rigid that everything, the motion of the planets and all, is as rigid as the workings of Paley's watch. And the universe is divided into a myriad of other small machines, like the parts of animals and plants. And these parts of things in the universe all have parts that seem to work together to enable them to fulfill various functions, enabling, animals to see and hear, etc. Means, that is the way their parts are constructed, are adjusted to ends, the purposes they serve, in ways that seem like they need design to get them to do this. And so the conclusion of the design argument is not only that God exists, but that God has an intelligence very similar to human intelligence. And that's where it's intended to go. Okay, so it's frustrate Vic Morawski Day. The computer's after me again. So that's what we're supposed to conclude from the design argument. Not only that God exists, but that God is an intelligence. Philo's view of the analogy is not that it is wrong to use analogies. He says analogies are fine if the things you're comparing are very similar. But again, what he says makes an analogy weak or strong is how similar the things are. And the less similar they are, the weaker the analogy, the weaker the argument, the less evidence the premises give for the conclusion. So the circulation of blood example shows that from a weak analogy, like comparing sap in plants to blood in human beings, you can be led to a completely wrong conclusion. So, to what is the building of a house compared? Well, it's compared with the universe. And here again, if we're trying to use an argument that says, well, okay, here are a bunch of homes, and they all seem to have needed a builder. So here's another home. I gave my own home as an example. It's more than 100 years old. No one in my family was around when it was built, and yet I don't doubt for 1 minute that it needed a designer and builder. Why? Because every other home I know of needed a designer and builder. It didn't just grow up overnight on that lot, right? And so my home must have needed that. But here again, Philo's view of this analogy is that it's a weak analogy because it's wrong to compare the universe as a whole to something, to a designed object. But again, you can say, well, but Paley is he comparing some similar things when he talks about the workings of a watch and the workings of something like the eye? Hume has Cleanthes mention stuff like that, but he doesn't say much about it. He just kind of goes on. So Hume doesn't really address Paley's point. Has Philo any alternative options to design? In other words, he says, if we perceive order, are there other forces in nature that could produce order? And his answer, of course, is yes. Now, you'll see in the slides, Hume mentions things like heat and cold, magnetism, some of the forces he knew in the science of his own day in the late 1700s. Now, so Hume speculates that there could be an internal principle in matter that causes it, that causes order. And I talked about the forming of sugar crystals. Here are these perfectly formed crystals that look like they've been cut like a jeweler cuts a diamond, and yet they're entirely formed by the forces of nature, when the water evaporates from the sugar solution and they form on the string. So Hume says that design is only one possible cause of order. And even if you perceive order, you can't automatically conclude that that order is there as a result of design. And of course I told, obviously Hume just speculates about an internal principle in matter. Hume's writing in the 1770s. Paley in 1802 says, you know what, somebody like Hume can say that, intricate things like eyes and ears came about by some internal principle in matter. Paley says, I don't even know what that would be. That's in 1802 when he publishes for the first time. But then Darwin, of course, tries to fill in the blanks here and say, well, what causes order is the development of advantageous variations by species. Over millions of years, you get better and better and better eyes till finally you get the eye that we have now by purely natural forces. And remember, Darwin's original view about evolution is that it is not a directed process. It's not directed at anything, much less producing us. And if we ran the process, the whole random process over again from scratch, the odds are against it's producing anything like us. Now, I mentioned my own bias in this is that, well, you could tell a pretty good story as an evolutionist about the development and the adaptation of organisms and more complex eyes over millions of years. But my problem with evolution as a non-directed process, as a totally random process, comes before that. Okay, when you get that going, you get organisms developed to that degree, it's easy to tell the evolutionist story. But how do you get the first strand of DNA? You know, by a totally random process. That's my problem. I told you I read a book called Human Destiny, where a scientist works out the enormous probabilities against even one strand of DNA developing in a totally random way. And I read that in high school, and I haven't changed my beliefs since then. No, I haven't seen any reason to modify that, you know. So I'm what is called a theistic evolutionist. You know, I'm not a young earth. I think God will use evolution as a tool. But anyway, remember, doesn't matter whether you write your essay from a standpoint I might agree with. You know, what matters is how well you write it, you know. Okay, so, I mean, I'm spending some time on this because this is one of the more complicated forms. Does Philo agree that the design argument at least implies that there's only one designer? No. He says there are lots of different possibilities. Even if we concluded that there was a designer, he says what Paley wants and Aquinas wants, that is that the designer of the universe should be the God of traditional monotheism, is only one option. He says, you know, you could have lesser gods. You could have senile gods creating the universe, or infantile gods that are just learning to make a world. Now, it isn't that this is what Paley himself believes, but he's making the logical point that from the same premises, you can get other conclusions just as naturally. As well, so even if you try to conclude a designer, he says that the designer is what Cleanthes wants, which is basically the god of monotheism, is only one option. Plus, Hume says you can't even conclude that if the universe were designed, that it needed only one designer. You could just as easily conclude that it was designed by a committee. He says if we talk about houses and ships, those have a multitude of people working on them, right? So Hume denies that the design argument can even show us that there's at least only one designer. He says you can just as easily conclude many. Again, it's not that Hume himself believes in a polytheistic religious system, but he's saying logically there are other conclusions that are equally as possible. Now, I don't know if Aquinas would have been very impressed by Hume's argument here, because for Aquinas there's only one real option here. these other gods are just figments of human imagination. So anyway, so I thought I'd at least go through that much of it. I mean, I always try to go, and even though this is more recent, I think it's a little more complicated. So, so bring a number 2 pencil. If anyone missed a roll, it should be up here somewhere. Oh, wait a second. That may not even be the right semester. This is one. That you can take that. Okay.